Okay, I guess to start with intros, my name is Alex. I am the first Gov speaker.
My name is Lucas. I'm going to be the second Gov speaker from Rodda's Disciples.
My name is Navneet. I'm going to be the first and third negation speaker on Irvington.
My name is Canuck. I'm going to be the second opposition speaker on Irvington.
Okay, cool. Let me just start my timer. Okay, starting in three, two, one. This is going to be a pretty simple speech. We have some definitions and framing at the top, and then three contentions coming out of the government side. Okay, starting out top of case, just to define what a prime is, it's defined as the single period of the greatest strength, vigor, or success in a person's life. And this house we're going to define as a rational actor. This is the basic assumption all rounds in parley make. And we're just going to say that the framework should be what is best for society because this is a narrative that society holds. And as such, we should evaluate its impacts on society. With that, three pieces of framing before getting into our case. The first being that we think that this round should be focusing primarily on the people who believe absolutely in this narrative that lives have primes and the effects that it has on them, because this is where the debate has the biggest margin. This is the group that this narrative is affecting. Second piece of framing, we think that notably, because this is a this house regrets motion, we should be evaluating what a world with this narrative looks like and what a world without this narrative looks like. This is important because we think it's the case that in a world where this narrative doesn't exist, an alternative narrative replaces it. What does this look like? We don't think that it says there exists primes, but rather that every stage of your life has some value, that there really is no prime, that there's happiness to be found at all stages of your life. In other words, sort of a lack of narrative, but rather something more accurate, that happiness is available at all times of your life. Last piece of framing is just kind of framing what this narrative actually looks like in the status quo. We think the predominant and by far the most popular way this narrative is proliferated is that there are forms of media and people who be your friends or your family who tell you that you reach your prime when you are younger, that the prime of your life, for example, is in your 20s when you are the most physically fit and the most socially active. Okay, with that, our first contention is on the anxiety this narrative exists. The first subpoint is on the anxiety you feel when you haven't yet reached your prime. As an overview and as, sort of referenced before, we think that this narrative is strengthened by a ton of social pressures. For example, there exists social media and the other forms of media that exist in the world, which show people who are living their best lives that they are living their prime youth. But there's also people around you you see reaching their primes, and there's people who tell you about their primes in their past. You see people doing primetime things, and you hear about descriptions about people's prime in the past. The endpoint of this framing is that there are a ton of social aspects of your life that are actively pressuring you to reach your prime, and there's a ton of pressure to actually reach that prime. The implication of this is twofold. First, we think that this necessarily makes the life leading up to your prime 100% more anxious because you know that a prime will eventually happen, but you're unsure of when. You see all these people reaching primes around you, but you don't know when you actually achieve your prime. But second, we think that it also makes people more likely to take reckless action because they see people around them reaching their prime and they want to reach it as well. The best example of this is the example of college. A lot of people in college don't want to waste their youth in college, and consequently, there are a ton of people who engage in things like partying, drug use, hookups, etc., because they want to enjoy their prime, they want to enjoy their youth. We think generally it makes people more risky, it makes people take less rational actions in order to reach that prime. The second subpoint is on when you've reached your prime. We think that when you have a narrative that says there's a singular definite prime in your life, you live under constant anxiety of it ending. You tell yourself, I can't let my prime slip away from me. So instead of actually relishing these moments, relishing the prime that you live, individuals are constantly anxious about them ending. which we think creates a form of anxiety. Because if you think that definitely a prime exists, you believe definitely in the end of that prime. And when you live what you believe is your prime, you feel anxious because you think it's going to end. And in that vein, we think that the prime you experience or the prime you think you experience is bad as well. The third and last subpoint is on when you've ended your prime. We think that the moment your prime ends, you necessarily think that you are just kind of less valuable. You think that you might not be as physically well. You don't think you can achieve the things you achieved in your prime. You necessarily think of yourself as a lesser being. We think that this is really bad because when you don't think that you are at your
So
prime,
why?
when you don't think you are totally declined, when you don't think that you are totally able, we think that you're less likely to do things like take risks, to kind of push yourself in your life, to send texts, to kind of try to get that new job because necessarily you think that the best part of your life has ended. This is why a ton of old people, a ton of people in their 40s, for example, tend to settle when they think their prime has ended. They stop pushing themselves. They stop, trying to push themselves and strive for more, which we think is the way meaning is created in life. People settle down because they necessarily think they're not at their prime, they're not at their best ability. Our second contention is on how you hedge your life against your prime. We think that when you're 10 years old, you might derive happiness from playing video games. When you're 40-year-old, you might derive happiness from raising your children. When you're 80 years old, you might define happiness as playing around with your grandchildren. The point of this is that throughout our lives, we derive happiness from different sources and in different ways. And we think to chalk one of those moments or periods of time as being the prime of your happiness robs you from the ability to enjoy the rest. Because rather than independently enjoying playing with your grandchildren, you constantly compare your current happiness to what you consider to be your prime happiness. We think that this makes it much harder to actually achieve fulfillment and happiness. Because rather than enjoying this unique form of happiness, you're forced into hedging it with another form of your happiness, with your prime happiness. This is what's known as the hedonic treadmill, with how people kind of hedge what they experience with the best thing they experience. And when you have a conception of what you think is the best, you constantly hedge the other moments of your life to that best, which we think uniquely robs you from the enjoyment you actually feel. We also just think it's hard to find long-term fulfillment because if you think your prime was the point in your life where you reach the maximum fulfillment and happiness within your life, and this narrative tells you that you can only experience this type of fulfillment and happiness during one and singular prime, then for individuals who don't think that they're in their prime, they can never feel truly fulfilled. Our third contention is on how this marginalizes old people. We think when this narrative tells society that once you aren't in
Sorry, I
your
just wanted to
prime,
bring up the fact you're over 15 seconds over time.
There's a 30-second grace period in the NYPDL.
Oh, my bad. My rules say 15, but okay.
nah, it's cool. Don't worry. Okay.
It's definitely 30.
There's a
Yeah.
pause. You now have about 15 seconds remaining on the clock if you would like to finish.
Again, I'm gonna start with my 15 seconds. Hold up. Let me just like set my timer to 15 seconds. Sorry, everyone. Okay. Starting now. We think when this narrative tells society that once you aren't in your prime, you're less valuable and you're not at your top life, we think that people necessarily marginalize old people. They see them as less productive, as less valuable to society. We think we shouldn't treat people differently because we think they're out of their prime. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Yeah, great speech. One more time, just sorry about the time thing. The last tournament I did had a very strict 15 seconds grace period. I thought it was the same here, but I guess I haven't debated NYPD in a while.
Just a reminder of the rules in NYPDL, the speeches are as follows. It's 7 minutes for the Gov first, then it's 2 minutes for Gov for first op, then it's eight I believe 8 minutes for op Gov 2 and then so on. But each speech has 30-second grace period, so you can continue all the way up to 8:30, for example, for your speech, and it is at our discretion to allow you to finish your statements.
Yeah, sure. That's my bad because again, the last tournament I did was different, but
No, that's totally
uh,
understandable.
okay. Yeah, so for a quick off time, Hi, my name is Zavdeet. I'm going to be the first and third speaker on the negation side of this topic one more time. For a quick roadmap, I'll go over framework and definitions quickly. Then I'll go into just like a quick definition of the burdens of this round, um, two main contentions, and then refutations to offside. Okay. You can start my time now. So first, on the framework of this round, we're going to define the prime in a very specific way, right? The prime of your life is a time in your life when you're highest and like most skillful in terms of a skill in your profession and trade, aka like success, right? And the other team gives you like the kind of dictionary definition of prime. But the thing is, we can't consider only the dictionary definition here, right? Like if you think about it, this is a lyric by Daft Punk. He's talking in slang. He's not talking in like strict dictionary definition English terms. Like for example, another thing Daft Punk might say is something like the term fire. And fire in like if you search that up in the dictionary, that doesn't mean like saying like, oh, this is great. But sometimes someone might say like, oh, this is like a fire statement, something like that. That means it's good, but that's not in the dictionary. So we have to be evaluating how this is used in slang as well. And in slang, prime is usually used to characterize the best time of your life in terms of like how skillful or like how able you are at that time. Okay. Next, we're saying this house, we agree with that it's a rational actor. For the 3 points that were made, we say that the round should just focus on like everyone in general, not only the people who like are affected by a prime, because we think that everyone in society is affected by this type of like narrative. Um, Framework for what's best in society, we think it's better to just define that as net benefits, so that's like just more inclusive. We can define like whichever side is proving that either primes are doing more good or doing more harm. Um, and then, yeah, the other observation points will be refuted in the rest of our case, as well as our response to negation. I mean, sorry, response to affirmation. Okay, the first contention is going to be expectations. And subpoint A under here is societal expectations. Basically, societally, if people believe that there's a prime in your life, they're going to not expect the same things out of your career later in your life, right? Like, for example, if you're a musician and you had a really good voice in like your 20s or your 30s or your 40s, but then like later in your 60s, your voice gets worse, then you don't want people to still be expecting the same quality of your production that you had before, because now you're just like physically incapable of doing the same thing, right? This happened recently when Dolly Parton, an old singer, was featured on a Sabrina Carpenter song, and the general public was really disappointed in her performance because of like how good she used to be perceived in the past. And a lot of people claim that she sounded like scratchy and unappealing, but in real life, that's just like the reality of what happens to your voice when you age. Therefore, the narrative that people have primes inherently lowers their expectations for you in terms of like the quality of stuff you can produce later in your life. And this is a good thing because obviously if you're going to become like less capable at something later in your life, you want to make sure that people are not like having their expectations too high to the point where you're going to be like beating yourself up about it. Like another example of this is like the new Taylor Swift album, right? And actually, I'll get into this example in my next sub point. But yeah, basically, dropping expectations isn't a bad thing because people can still like your work, like longtime fans or even new fans, right? Like one example I have of this is Andre 3000. He was a rapper who was pretty famous earlier, and he still does some songs now, but no one is expecting him to like top the billboards or do like the same amount of success he did before, right? But long-term fans still appreciate his work because they like appreciate what he did before, but they're not expecting, of course, like the same quality of like voice or vocal production, etc. Next subpoint is self-expectations. Basically, if society expects something from you, we're also thinking that this is going to pressure you to expect the same thing about yourself. So one example of this is actually Taylor Swift's new album, The Life of a Showgirl. She basically felt in this album that she kind of like felt societal pressure to be like more of like a modern woman or feel more like with the times. And because of that, she integrated some lyrics that use like current slang, right? She used words like lit or girl boss, etc. But the fact of the matter is, this is just not like the type of way she talks, and a lot of fans noticed that, and a lot of people critiqued her lyrics for being like cringe or using these words incorrectly. Therefore, what happened here is society expected her to be like with the times, like she was before, and therefore that meant that she had an expectation on herself to do the same, and therefore she performed worse than she actually could have if she didn't have that expectation for herself. This does not only happen for famous people. Think of expectations from people like family and friends as well. So this kind of extends to every single person that we could talk about, right? Therefore, if we adopt the narrative that we have primes, we're going to be okay with the fact that like, okay, we don't have the skills that are in demand right now, or we don't have like the same knowledge that the people do right now. Therefore, we're not going to feel bad about it for ourselves, right? Like, for example, another example is Elton John, who was a big singer in the past, but he had some surgery that affected his voice, and now he accepts the fact that like, okay, I can't sing as like well as I could before, and therefore he had better mental health prevents things like possible suicide in the future, etc. Okay, subpoint or contention two is going to be self-growth in other areas. Basically, having the idea that a prime in your like career existed before, that means that in the future, you're going to be able to look back at that as like a time of fulfillment, but you're also not going to regret that that period is over, right? Like, as an example, if a basketball player knows the narrative of like there being a prime, they will acknowledge like once they got to a certain age, they'll be like, okay, I don't have the same physical capabilities as I did before. Maybe I should focus on things outside of basketball in my life. That's going to lead to these people pursuing like other passions, like maybe creative things, like interacting with family more. Anything else they want to do, it's completely like personal, right? And when you have a narrative that you did have a prime, you're not going to be like beating yourself up about it, right? You're not going to say, "Hey, I really wish I was still this amazing basketball player. I can't believe like I'm physically like feeling more tired." You're not going to feel that about yourself. You're going to accept it. You're going to be like, "Yeah, sure, this point in my career is not like as high as it used to be, but I'm fine with that, and I'm going to focus my life on other things that I now can do." And a second point on this is in turn, when you know you have a prime in your life, you know when you should also be trying the hardest in your career and not wasting your life, right? Like, for example, if I was a singer, I would know that like in my 20s or in my 30s or in my like younger years, I would know I have a good voice and I would know like, okay, I should not waste this voice. I should actually use it to make productions now before I lose this ability later in life. Therefore, I'm going to focus on my career in my younger years. Then when I grow up, I'll focus on like my family more, etc. I again get to decide what like pride means for me exactly. Okay, and then the harms here. Not having the narrative that people's primes is especially harmful is harmful to people's health. Like, for example, many boxers these days are boxing even like past their prime, even though they're very old at this time, and they're getting injured from things like this. So if there was no narrative, or if there was a narrative that people did have a prime, these boxers would accept that, like, I'm not at that same physical capability. I would stop boxing. I would stop getting like these bad like health impacts from boxing. Okay. Now responses to AF case. For their first point about anxiety, one of the things they bring up is like how in college you engage in like partying and drug use and you waste your younger years. However, this is not anything to do with careers. This is just a side effect of college students like getting freedom for the first time in your life, right? Like think about it as a kid, you're constrained by your parents, you go to college, now you have a new sense of freedom. It's just a byproduct of that. It has nothing to do with believing your life has a prime, right? For the rest of their points, it can honestly be cross-applied with a lot of our case. Like just look to the fact that you're not going to be living in anxiety. You're going to be instead accepting the fact that your physical capabilities have passed and you're going to be like, okay, that's fine. I can do something else with my life now. Next, they basically tell you that you will yourself think you are less valuable. However, no. If you know that your physical abilities are not as good as before, that is not a reason to think you are less valuable. And this is a very ableist point of view, right? Basically, what the other side is saying here is if I'm less physically capable, then I'm going to think of myself as a lower individual. That is ableist by definition. What we should actually be seeing here is when you realize that, like, yeah, my physical capabilities aren't up to par as what they used to be, I'm not going to consider myself as like a worse person. I'm just going to say, like, yeah, I want to focus on something else in my life now. I know I cannot do things again. Like I can't box anymore. I'm old, but I accept that and that's fine. Right? The next thing they talk about is hedging life against prime. They basically say that like in the future, you're going to keep like comparing your current life to like your past prime. Again, this is not how it's going to work, right? Prime is about your ability. And if you realize and you accept the fact, and society also accepts the fact that you're past your prime, you're past your physical ability, you're past your career ability, whatever that might be, they're going to accept it and you're going to accept it and you're going to be fine with it. Then for their last contention, quickly, marginalizing old people. You're not going to think they're less valuable to society. You're again just going to think they're not able to produce like the same amount they did before, but that doesn't make you ableist, or you don't have to have an ableist point of view there. You can just accept the fact that you don't have the same ability. And yeah, with that, I urge a strong negation ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
All right. Let me just get my timer ready. I'm just gonna go top of case, then op case, then gov case. Let me just get a sip of water. All right. I'm gonna start my time in 3, 2, 1. On the top of case, like the op case is like here there's four singers and here's how they lost their voice and over time they got worse and worse, but they never actually interact with the narrative and explain to you how it actually works. They just give you examples. I'll get into why that actually matters throughout my case. On definitions, they tell you that, like, your prime should only relate to skill. But I think there's just no reason why it should. They only justify this by saying, oh, look at slang. But like, I don't know, on the East Coast, maybe slang tells me that, your prime is about everything. And on the West Coast, it tells you that your prime is only about your skills. Very clearly, we shouldn't be basing this round about slang because, everyone's from different regions of the America. Slang is different. Just base it off of the dictionary definition, that being, the prime of your life where you're the most skillful, the most vigorous, have the most strength, have the most fulfillment. And yes, this is about a lyric, but the resolution itself is not a lyric. There are a lot of narratives that say lives have prime, and this isn't about slang. It's about the actual narrative in society, which does tell you that there's a point in your life where you have the most fulfillment, have the most strength, and that's what we should debate. And this definition still allows all of their points to stand. We're not like I think I'm in protected time, but we're not excluding any of their points from this debate. I just think it's a fair definition. So given that, we're gonna move into their case. They have three claims for you. Their first contention is on expectations and how like people aren't going to expect old people to do so well. First, people aren't going to expect old people to. People on our side are still not going to expect old people to sing really well. Like, we still have access to science. We know that people lose their voice and aren't up to date with singing. It's unclear why you need this idea of a prime to understand that as you get older, your voice stops working as well. Like, I think in both worlds, people know that as you get older, your voice doesn't work as well. You don't need the narrative of a prime to explain that to people. But even if you don't buy that point, we turn this entire claim because we think that this narrative leads to discrimination in the workplace. If you think that older people are going to be less skillful and less useful because they're, quote, out of their prime, then guess what? You're not going to want to hire them because the societal narrative tells you that people who are older are less skillful and less adept at working. So guess what? When people are deciding who to hire, they refuse to hire older people. They start firing their older people, and it promotes ageism. On their side, where they tell you that old people will be less skillful no matter what, because once they leave their prime, they're just going to deteriorate in skill, then guess what? And you're going to be fired from your job. You're not going to be hired. This narrative just clearly leads to ageism. So just turn this entire point. These expectations of old people to be performing worse leads to societies not favoring old people, not hiring old people, and firing old people. Then I think our counterfactual allows you as an individual to move on from leaving, your moment of being the best singer without being hurt. Because like let's take this example of a singer. Once a singer gets older and is worse at singing, rather than being upset that they're out of their prime, our counterfactual said that you're moving on to a new part of your life with different values. So maybe in my 20s, my life was centered around singing, but maybe now that I've reached my 30s, maybe my life will center more about doing charity work and being a philanthropist, or maybe about being our parent or being a parent. Our counterfactual tells you that at different points in your lives, you will have different values and different goals. That means that when one of those goals ends up, ending, you can just move on to a different set of goals. But their thing of a prime says that your entire life is defined by your height, and everything after will be worse. So if I'm a singer who's told that I will only be worse at singing, I will never reach my prime, then I'm just going to live the rest of my life feeling sad and regretful because I'll never be able to be who I used to be. Just very clearly, by giving people a new set of values, we help them move on from the things they've lost, like their singing. And this is all just beaten by the refutations I've given you above. Their second contention is on self-growth in other areas, but they never really warrant this out to you. If I'm told that I'll never be as skilled as I used to be, why wouldn't I be upset? They just assert this, but they don't explain why. I'm pretty sure if all of society said at the moment that you stop being like 20, you're suddenly less skilled and less useful, I probably will be upset. They assert that, they assert that that's not the case, but they never really warrant it out to you. I'll warrant it out to you. If I'm told by all of society that that I'm less useful, that I'm less capable, that I can never have this same amount of fulfillment that I used to have, then guess what? I almost definitely will be upset. Our world gives you a way out. Our counterfactual tells you that different parts of your lives have different values. So maybe at one point in your life, your values and goals are to be a really good singer. And at another point in your life, your values and goals are centered on being a parent. This is preferable to constantly comparing yourself to one moment. And instead, our counterfactual allows you to define different parts of your lives by different goals and different values. Their third claim is like this, or like they bring up this like boxing example. I just think this isn't applicable. They drop the fact that we're looking mainly at those who are directly affected by this narrative, those who fully believe in this narrative. And clearly boxers probably don't believe it, like their prime is over if they're still, boxing after their 20s. What do they say to our case? On their first contention, they say that, they say two things. The first is that this has nothing to do with careers, but I think the narrative isn't always about careers. It's about life in general. And then the second thing is that the second response is that you will realize that you will, quote, realize that you have less physical abilities. This is exactly our point. When you realize that you have less ability, that your prime is over, there's a crippling anxiety you feel. I'll never be who I used to be. That makes you really sad. On our side of the house, we reframe this. You're not going to be the same person who you used to be because you'll be a new person. Instead of being a singer, you're a parent or a philanthropist or a grandparent, any number of things. But allowing you to reframe your life around new values and new goals instead of constantly harboring back to your, quote, prime allows you to move on with your life without constantly being held back. What do they say to our second contention? They give one response, which is that prime is about ability. But I think no, it's more than it's about more than just ability, because very clearly, when we as a society think about your prime, we think about like the best moment in your life, the peak of your life, and the peak of your life includes more than just like your skills. It includes your happiness. It includes your strength. It includes a number of things. And even if it was about our ability, our argument still applies. You hedge your abilities now to your abilities at your prime. So if I used to be a really good singer and now I have a really bad voice, I'm constantly going to be upset about that. That'll make me feel really bad. And it's like an average person. Maybe I used to be a really good mathematician. Now I think I'm too old. My brain can't do math. I'm going to feel really bad. Our world gives you a way to reframe your aging and reframe your progression throughout life, which stops this self-hate and anxiety. And the response to our third claim is that like you're not going to stop valuing older people. You're just going to say that they have less ability. Like, I think that's definitely just valuing them less. If you say that old people have less ability, then like you're allowing
Well,
for ageism to happen, you're allowing for discrimination to happen. You're saying that old people have less ability. Just look to my turn about discrimination in the workplace. If society says that older people have less ability, then people won't hire older people. People will discriminate against older people. Very clearly, that point just doesn't stand. So, what is this debate likely about? What I think is the most important thing is that if your life is centered around your prime, you go through three major phases. The first is that of anticipating your prime. You're anxious. Will I ever reach my prime? Am I experiencing my prime right now? Will I never have a prime? That makes you anxious. That gives you anxiety. That gives you burnout. Once you reach your prime, you can never fully enjoy it, given that you're always stressing that it's going to end. I'm in the peak of my life. If you're in the peak of your life, very clearly you don't want it to end, so you'll constantly be burdened and stressed about it ending, preventing you from fully enjoying and taking advantage of it. And once your prime ends, you live the rest of your life hedging all of your future experiences against your prime, which makes it really difficult to actually enjoy new things. Our counterfactual gives you a world where different stages of your lives are centered around different sets of values. So maybe when I'm no longer good at singing, I can move on to a new set of values, a new set of goals, and that allows me to move forward in life and find new sources of fulfillment without constantly hedging my happiness against my prime. And for all those reasons, I urge a gov ballot. Thank you, Judge.
All right, that was a great speech. I have 8 minutes and a half on the clock. Yeah, so for order of my speech, I will just be going over like responses on framework and then moving on to the op case and then gov. If everyone is ready, then my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. I could not be prouder to oppose the resolution that this House regrets the narrative that lives have primes. So firstly, on the framework, we see that like under the definition of prime, there is like a lot of debate. We argue that like they argue that the definition of prime is just like the single period of greatest strength and success. However, we argue that like looking at like first of all, we argue that there is like a clear definition in terms of slang where that is what the lyrics are based on, how like the definition dictionary of fire doesn't include anything like, oh, fire means great, but that's how it's used in slang, and the point of the lyric is to be like in regard to the topic, and so there is a reason like why the lyric is there. Additionally, they claim that like slang can be different in different places, but we argue that like we have to look at this in terms of the way that the framer intended the topic to be debated. The common acceptance of like in slang in general is that like the prime is a time in your life when you are highest in terms of your skill in profession or trade, otherwise known as success, right? And so the lyric is literally part of the resolution. They are like over specifying with their definition that a lack of prime is just stages of life instead, right? And so like in this regard, when they argue that it is just about that, we're just saying it's just about singers, we're arguing that it can be the same for people in business and otherwise like people with families, etc. So now I'd like to move on as of like clarified the framework into the opposition case, our first contention was on expectations. We talk about societal expectations and self-expectations. They say that people are going to like expect old people to sing very well and that like this narrative leads to discrimination in the workplace. But we argue that the narrative of prime is an acceptance of like that you have had a prime, that you have had a time in which like you know that like at that point in time like you had some kind of success, right? And so when they argue that like they're claiming that like now with this narrative old people think like old people are less useful and that they're not going to be hired. This is quite literally like an ableist point of view when you say that the value of old people is reduced by the fact that they are not able anymore. We see that not everything is based on this. You can think about other careers such as software engineer managers. Also consider the fact like why do people retire in the first place? When they argue that old people won't be hired because they are less skillful or less adept at working, we argue like people retire from their job because their priorities shift, right? And so what we're saying here is that knowing that like you've had your prime, you are then able to retire, you're able to shift your priorities into other aspects, right? And because of this narrative, it isn't a situation where like we aren't like able to acknowledge that like people have different abilities and goals. Because when they argue that like you're moving on with your life with different values, this is exactly what like opposition is arguing for. We're saying that like acknowledging you've had a prime, acknowledging also that you've had different abilities and goals, then you can move on, right? You once you complete the prime of your trade, you can move on to other aspects of your life without this like this pressure that they say, or without like not being able to like use your voice. They claim that like your life is like determined by your prime, but this just simply isn't true. It's just a time of height like in your trade, as we mentioned, and as goes like by the definition. Additionally, like on our second point, where we talk about self-growth and how people can look back on their prime as a time of fulfillment and to focus on other things as well. They argue that like there's no reason why people wouldn't be like they pose the question like why wouldn't I be so upset if I'm not as skillful? However, the reasoning here is that it's because you aren't trying to do something that you aren't able to do anymore. Like take our boxers example for one example where we show you that like there are people where like they're putting their lives at risk because they aren't recognizing that they've had a prime and that prime is over, right? And that can lead to things like even fatality, serious injuries that may not be like repairable. Additionally, they talk about how like different parts of your lives again have different values in response to this same subpoint. And we argue once again the definition of prime, where we see that like prime defines this. We're arguing for a societal narrative of prime. We want others to acknowledge that your skill is not the same, that you've had a prime, and that therefore that prime is now over. And once it is over, you're able to move on and do other things with your life without facing this societal pressure, right? And we have a whole like again once again like our third subpoint on this contention, we talk about the harms of again many boxers who might not have as much physical capability. They completely drop this argument. And additionally, their main argument, I just want to move on past this point. Their main argument in this debate is that they have an access to science in their world, so they will accept the fact that they are less capable. However, people don't listen to science always. For example, science literally says boxing is probably bad for your health if you do it for such a prolonged period of time. Singing is probably bad for your voice as well if you're going to continue doing it for a long period of time. But does that mean that people don't do it? No, people still do it. People think about the societal value of actions. Singers sings because it is good in society, it's accepted in society, it gets the money, it is their art, it is their passion. A specific societal narrative ensures that society accepts them for losing their skill, and that means that they accept it as well, right? So now I'd like to move on into the responses on the government case. We see under the point of anxiety, they talk about how like this, like about college and how people don't want to waste their youth. However, again, that's kind of different. It's not career based, what we argue. And they claim that like this isn't always like about careers, it's about life in general. However, we want to see that like this is a very positive conversation. We aren't saying that like reminiscing on happiness is a bad thing. It's better than no like motivation at all, because the prime is defined by what like your trait is. It is self-defined. So in fact, the opposite happens where like post your prime, if there is no narrative, you might end up taking reckless action or to continue doing what you're doing rather than acknowledging that your prime is over, right? And so when they argue that when you've reached your prime, like you live under constant anxiety, this is just like not true if we have a narrative. The whole point here is that like when they claim that like when you realize you have less ability, it leads to like anxiety and stuff and that you will be a new person. This isn't like factually true, considering the fact that like we are able to see that with a new narrative, you're able to then like understand that you like are past this prime and that you are able to move on with your life. You're able to do other things and you're able to like pursue other passions or even like like have a family, etc. So, and then their third sub point under this point where they talk about like how once the prime is ended, you think you're less valuable and how like that like you can't achieve the same things. Again, we mentioned how like this is you're basically saying that people who are normally not able to do something are somehow worse, which is an ableist perspective. They claim that like when you have less ability, you will have more anxiety, you won't be who you used to be. And it's, again, the same thing is here. Like on our side, we aren't saying that all people can't move on. We're saying the narrative is allows what allows people to move on, right? And so like when they claim that like people settle down, we have to consider again the like motivation of that is that they understand that this narrative, this prime of their life is like over, right? And so they aren't settling down, they're just changing their priorities, they're doing what they want to do in life now, right? And then moving on to their like their point on like the hedge life against prime, they talk about this like hedonic treadmill and how like you hedge every experience you have with what you think was the best. But again, with here we argue that with the narrative you don't feel this way. The societal narrative of the prime is like the internal link to feeling this. It is the internal link to like how this prime is important, why the prime is so key to have it, so that you aren't like so you are able to have more fulfillment, you are able to have more enjoyment in life. They argue that like in their third point that people will like marginalize old people and how like they're less valuable to society now. And again, like we see that this like value is not defined by ability. This is an ableist perspective, an ableist point of view, when in fact society views like a prime as having been like at this like height of your trade. It doesn't like necessarily mean like discrimination will occur, right? We also see that like again, like when they argue like you're hedging all future experiences and you can move on to new values, this is like a plan plus. Like you can't define what the lack of a prime is. This is like very hyper specific. And so for all of these reasons, I strongly urge a opposition ballot. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hi again, Navneet. Now this is my third negation speech. So quick off time. I'm going to go over top of case first. So I'll be going over the definition of prime. I'll go over their definition of a lack of prime. Then I'll go over like a kind of like an independent reason to vote them off just off the bat. Then I'll go over into talking about their main argument as the affirmation. I'll say why the negation uniquely solves, and then I'll collapse on the biggest impact here. Okay. Great. You can start my time now. So quickly on the top of case, first let's look at their definition. Again, we say that prime is the when you're in like the highest in your skill or trade or profession. This is again how it's like defined by most pop culture. You can like just gut check yourself on that. It's also what like Daft Punk intended. They say that the lyric being there has no value. However, it's the framer's intent. Why would they put the lyric there if they didn't want us to like argue about what Daft Punk actually meant? And you know, like with slang definitions, we can see that it's this. Even if you do buy their definition, though, we will still win either way, and we will prove that to you in the speech, right? Also, for their definition of a lack of a prime, that is also over specification. We think this is an abusive definition, and they should
Yeah,
be dropped
well,
right off the bat. Yeah,
yeah, well, you never
last
make
time.
an abuse. You've never in your first in your you never make an abusive definition call until now. Like you've never said the word this is an abusive thing to do.
Okay,
You
you
win this
can just
point.
drop the word abusive, but I'll say it's an unfair definition.
I mean that's also new, but okay.
No, my second speaker said it. Okay. Yeah, you can resume my time now. But as my second speaker was saying, this is an unfair definition is the fact that you can't just define exactly what a lack of prime looks like in society. You have to think about like what people would actually perceive. They're just making up this narrative of like what people would perceive, which is just like they give no warranting for why people would do this, and it's unfair. Okay, next, drop them right off the bat also for their ableist argumentation, right? They basically say that people will value old people less in society because people acknowledge that they don't have the same amount of skill. This is an inherently an ableist argument. They're basically saying people in society are ableist because they see someone with less skill, therefore they think they're less valuable. People aren't ableist by definition. Like think about like a soldier, right? No one is blaming an old soldier for no longer being in the military. Instead, they appreciate and revere them for what they did for their country in the past. No one is saying, "Oh, you're old, you can't fight for our military anymore, you're useless." That's an ableist argument. Drop them right there for trying to characterize us as doing that. Okay, next. Their main argument that they bring up here is they say, okay, we have access to science in our world, therefore people will accept the fact that they're less capable and they'll be fine with it. However, what matters here, Judge, is not science, it's society. People don't listen to science always. By the argumentation that my second speaker gives you, that science says things like, okay, boxing is probably bad for your health. A lot of these sports, like even football, might be bad for your health. Singing for a prolonged time is bad for your voice. There's just a lot of things that people actually do, like even like for high schoolers, right? Sleeping too late is bad for your health, but many people still do it for success. People do what society wants them to do for their actual passion and to promote what they want in life, right? No one cares what science says about sleep. Or even if they do, it's not that big of a deal compared to society. Therefore, let's think about which side is actually solving for the societal expectations. One more time, look at the topic. We as the negation side are saying that we like not having, or we like the narrative that lives have prime. The word narrative specifically implies the societal expectation, the societal agreement that lives have prime, that you're gonna lose like your same like ability later in your life. And when society accepts that, you also accept that. That's the main key here. It's not just science telling you that you can't do anything anymore. It's society accepting you for who you are and for like what you've done and the fact that you don't have the same skill. It's society accepting you're moving on from your profession to new things in your life. Okay. Now, this is basically uniquely why the word prime solves. They are basically arguing for the same thing as us, right? They're basically saying, like, yeah, it's good if people have, like, some time in their life that they talk about their profession and then some time in their life that they think about their grandchildren. That's what we're saying too. The reason we win is we access that impact better because of the idea of a societal narrative of a prime. With, again, the societal narrative of a prime, people accept that you have this. And, right, by the argumentation in my first speech as well, that I say that societal expectations inherently lead to personal expectations, right? By this, the Taylor Swift example I brought up, where like society expected her to be modern, therefore she adapted her lyrics to fit that. However, if society accepts her as being like not, kind of like old timey and not along with the times anymore, then there would be actual acceptance, and she would accept herself. She would have changed her lyrics. It would have been good. Okay, therefore, now that we as the negation have established our access to the actual impact in this round, we collapse on the fact that we just access this impact more, right? We have a higher magnitude. On their side, they are only getting people who believe in like the science specifically to actually have these good impacts of later in life, looking back and be like, and being like satisfied with their life and, like being okay with that, right? They get the impact of people who have like science are like fine in their mental health. The reason our impact is bigger is because we access people with science, but also society at the same time. We access people who listen to society. Therefore, by definition, we have a larger magnitude on the number of people who are feeling like societally safe and like socially like accepted. And therefore, we instantly win this debate under the framing of net benefits. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Let me just set up my timer. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna start in three, two, one. Not gonna lie, this is probably one of the most interesting rounds I've ever been with. Okay, I'm gonna start with clarifications. Let's just start on the definition of what a prime is. The way they justify their definition of only talking about careers and ability is that this is slang. But Lucas gives you three brilliant responses which just beat this. First, that slang is unresolvable. That slang definitionally varies by person to person from East Coast to West Coast. There is no way to resolve the fact that this is slang. They later add on in the MO that there's a common acceptance of what slang is. But ask yourself, judges, what is the common acceptance of the word? It is a dictionary definition. That's the whole point of dictionaries, that they create a common acceptance, which means if there is common acceptance, you derive that from the dictionary. The second response is that, sure, the lyric that's attached to the motion has slang, but the resolution that we are debating, which is that this house regrets the narrative that lives has primes, is not a lyric. It is a resolution, which means we are supposed to have a textbook, interpretation of the resolution. finally, even if it is slang, they've never actually given you any linguistic or cultural analysis as to why slang is only about career or ability. We've actually given you the intuition pump argument that when you say things like prime, you think about physical features, you think about ability, you think about everything. It's kind of a holistic thing on, when you are most happy in your life. With that, what are some questions that need answering after the op block? I think the first question that needs answering is, hold up. Wait, my flow just like crashed. Is it fine if I pause time real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Your time is paused at 1 minute and 40 seconds.
Yeah, okay, cool. I just reloaded. Okay, I think I should be good. Okay. The first question I want to answer is accepting that you are past your prime good or bad? They give you two reasons as to why it is. The first is that, quote unquote, you are able to accept that you don't have ability anymore. First, we think that people just aren't going to expect old people to be able to sing, box, or play basketball. Like, we still have science on our side. We still know people lose their voice and aren't up to date with slang when they are old. It's unclear why you need to believe in the concept of a prime to conceptualize this. Their response to this argument is that some people don't believe in science. First, not sure why you need science to know that old people lose their ability to sing, like you see your grandma and you see the examples of singers they give you. But second, I'm not sure if we should focus on the people who don't believe in science in this round. Like they're probably going to die on either side and like not vaccinate themselves or something. Second, even if you don't buy that, we just effectively turn this argument in the MG. We think that this conception is what leads to age discrimination in the workplace. If you think that older people are going to be unproductive because they're out of their prime, then you don't want to hire them and you don't want to. So this narrative quite literally promotes ageism by saying old people are less able and thus you don't actually hire them. Third, our counterfactual just also allows you to move on without being hurt. So, like, once a singer gets older and is worse at singing, rather than being upset that they're out of their prime, they can move on to a new part of their life and can value their life, for example, as grandparents and as non singers. The second thing they tell you is that it allows people to move on, but they've never actually proven why it allows people to move on. Because if I'm someone who believed I was just at the best part of my life, and for the years preceding that, I'm going to be inherently worse, and I'm never going to have that ability, then obviously I can't move on. Obviously, I live the rest of my life in anxiety. They've never actually mechanized to you how it allows people to move on. Next question is, are we being ableist because we get this theory shell run on us? First, you can't use theory in the NYPDL. Sorry, guys. But B, if you care about ableism, drop them. They themselves define the prime as when you have the most ability. And then they go on to say multiple times in their speech that old people inherently have less ability. So if you care about ableism, just straight up drop them. Last question is do you achieve more on their side? I think that this is just beaten by our claim, which is that when your prime ends, you inherently just do not want to achieve more. You think you don't have that ability anymore. And accordingly, you are less likely to take risks and actually push yourself for the preceding years of your life when you're not in the prime. So I think just on the long term, you achieve more on our side. With that, one ballot, which is this, that you live miserably on their side. First, when you haven't reached your prime, they conceded that you're both more anxious because you're constantly waiting to achieve your prime. You don't know when it's happening. And B, they've conceded that you take more reckless actions like partying, like drug use, like hookups, because you're trying desperately to achieve your prime, which means your life preceding your prime is miserable. For when you've reached your prime, they've conceded the argument that you live under constant anxiety of it ending. You constantly think, I can't let my prime slip away from me. So even if they're correct that you do great things during your prime, the fact that you're always anxious is really bad. Then C, on, when you're past your prime, I think I've made it pretty obvious. You don't push yourself. You live pretty miserably. This means we control the greatest link into happiness because at all stages of your life, you're anxious, you're living miserably. That obviously is incredibly bad. And they've conceded the analysis that we should be focusing on the people this narrative affects. For all these reasons, very proud to propose. Good debate.
Good debate.
Great debate, guys.